Okay, you've created your first app and now you are trying to figure out how to actually make money from it. Does that sound familiar? There are so many different monetization strategies out there, it can be really difficult to know which one is the right one for your business. In this video, let me take you through 9 of the most common monetization strategies, how and when to use them, as well as some common mistakes to avoid. Now, while I refer to apps, these same strategies apply regardless of if you are creating a native mobile app, a web app, or a third-party app to plug into an existing ecosystem like Shopify or Salesforce, for example. With that said, let's go.
So we're going to start getting into monetization of your app. This is obviously a very important piece in the process because why are we here if we're not getting paid, right? So before we get into actual monetization calculations or anything like that, what I really want to do is first just step you through the different monetization types. Depending on your application, your target market, a number of different factors, there are different strategies that you can use. Now, you might already have ideas of exactly which model you want to use. That's totally fine, but I definitely recommend it looking at all the options because it's not a case of one size fits all, and it's also not a case of that you just have to pick one. There are ways that you can monetize across multiple different strategies, and in fact I'd highly recommend that you have at least 2 different monetization strategies in your application so that you've got different channels for income to come in at all times. With that said, let's get into the different options. So to start with, we've got the Freemium Plus Paywall option. This is quite common, particularly for web apps, where you will see there's some sort of pricing plan, and you go to their pricing plan and they have a free plan that lets you do a certain amount of functionality before you hit a stage that you need to start paying. Now, this is a really good way to build up your user base, get a great following for your product, but you need to understand that in this model there are people that will only want to use the free version for as long as possible, and if you make the free version too scalable, then they will just use the free version indefinitely. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is just something to keep in mind. Now, one of the challenges with this particular model is that if you are going down the freemium approach, there are a number of factors that you need to consider. So one being, how are you going to support freemium users? By default, those users will be wanting to reach out and get as much support as any other user, and so you need to be very careful that you make it clear to the freemium users what channels they can use, whether that's standard support ticketing, whether that's just a forum where they go and post questions and get responses from the general community and yourselves, or whether it is just completely self-serve and they can only do email support, for example. So definitely something to keep in mind with the freemium model. The other thing to keep in mind with the freemium model is that you need to be quite careful in terms of what you decide to include in the freemium set of features versus those that will be your paid features, because what you don't want to do is create a situation where somebody comes in and basically can only do a couple of things and then immediately hit a paywall that then forces them to start paying if they want to continue on. That style of freemium, at least in my experience, is not particularly successful. If you're going to go down the freemium path, you really need to give them enough value that they can generate themselves in the free version with the ability to grow within your application to the point where they can genuinely see a need to start paying. Now, next I'm going to talk about licensing.
We will get to that in a moment, but if you are new here or this is your second or more video, I have something called the virtual high five, which means if you are getting value from these videos and you have watched 2 or more, all I ask is that you hit the like and subscribe button. It really helps me out, as while I make these videos free to watch, it does take my time and energy to put them together. So if you have watched 2 or more videos, hit that like and subscribe button, and if you're finding them useful, give me that high five.
Licensing is by far the most popular model in the market right now, depending on the type of application that you're doing. If it is a B2B application, then you definitely want to look at some sort of licensing component. And even in some B2C models, it makes sense to look at licensing as well. Once again, you would have seen this even in the applications that you use, where you go in and you pay a monthly license to effectively have the right to continue using that software. If you stop paying that license, then generally you might get downgraded to a free plan if they've gone down the freemium approach, or you might literally just have your account switched off and potentially have the data removed once you stop paying your license. All completely legitimate strategies. Once again, depends very much on your particular customer base. One thing to keep in mind is that if you are intending on building your application to the point where you ultimately want to sell it off to somebody else, or you want to get acquired, or even if you want to get major investment, what a lot of the investors and acquirers are going to want to see is what's called MRR, or monthly recurring revenue, if you're not familiar with that term. And so the licensing option is a really good way to prove ongoing recurring revenue, where they can see that you have X number of users. They're going to want to see monthly recurring revenue calculations, whether that is that you have contracts in place for month-to-month revenue, annual revenue, quarterly revenue. Those are the types of things they're going to want to see. And essentially they want to be able to calculate the predictability of your revenue growth. I'm going to skip over the red notes for a moment. I will circle back to those and explain why. So next we'll jump into implementation fees. Now this is definitely something to keep in mind. It is something that can be very important during the early stages of your application, particularly if you're working on a reasonably complex business application. Implementation fees are quite common in the business world, where effectively the businesses understand that you are the expert in your software and you can help them configure it to be optimal for their business. So in that case, you're most likely going to charge an implementation fee upfront to help them configure everything, and then hand it back to them after that period and ultimately let them take over and then just pay you a license. Another good thing to keep in mind with implementation fees is that if you do build up an application where there is an implementation fee attached, implementation fees are a really good way of bringing on partners to your application and actually getting your partners to do the implementation for you. If you get to the stage where partners are doing the implementation for you, then you become a lot more scalable, because instead of just you and or your team being able to build it, not only do you have other people on the market that can build your solution for customers, but if they start generating enough revenue doing that, then they're going to become real promoters for you, and they're going to be out there actually selling on your behalf as well. Next, let's talk microtransactions and or in-app purchases. This is another really good strategy, particularly if you're going down the freemium approach, where you give users an initial free version and then you have the ability to continuously give them little pieces of value that they want to pay for, and they can just do that ad hoc as required. Now, microtransactions and in-app purchases can be a lot harder to get predictable revenue, particularly at first as you're building up your user base. Once you have a large enough community in place or a large enough user base, then you will start seeing some consistency in the microtransactions or in-app purchases that you get every single month. I would definitely say that this model is one that you're going to be applying only if you're going to have a really high user base. Otherwise, you're just not going to get enough foot traffic through your application to make in-app purchases worthwhile. Next, we have professional services. Professional services come in a few different forms. The most common is where there is some sort of hourly rate attached to your application. So that might be that they purchase your application and then they hire you as a consultant to assist with some sort of functionality along the side. It is very similar to potentially an implementation fee, but with the professional services, there's usually a number of different services that you offer that they can pick and choose depending on the types of options that you have in your application and the types of business use cases, etc. Once again, professional services is another good one that ties in with partners. So if you do want to go down a partner-led strategy, then definitely consider how there can be professional service components to your application. Another method where you will have seen professional service come in for platforms, things like Fiverr or Upwork, where your application is actually technically a marketplace that is helping connect two different types of users, but then they are providing professional services through your application and you are actually gaining transaction fees generally in that equation. Now let's start talking about these red tickets and why I've got them highlighted. So with these particular ones, they are all definitely legitimate pricing models. The main thing I would say is there are a couple of caveats to using them. So one, every single one of these require very high volume. So whether it's one-off purchase, you're going to need to know that you have thousands and thousands of users that can make that one-off purchase. Or if you're looking at things like ad revenue, sponsorship, or even transaction fees, you need a lot of foot traffic coming through your application to get to the point where the ad revenue is going to be significant enough to fund you and your business. In all of these scenarios, I would say that you should think very carefully about whether these are the right strategies for you to use. These strategies generally require quite large marketing budgets in order to get to the stage where you're generating significant enough revenue that it makes it worthwhile, and they are going to take a lot longer to put in place than some of the green tickets that I've got on screen right now. With that said though, like I say, my recommendation is that you have at least 2 of these in your application, if not more. Be careful not to go overboard, but with 2 of them, then you can do something like a license plus transaction fees, or a license and sponsorship, implementation fee and professional services and a license, for example, or even freemium with ad revenue and a paywall that adds additional functionality. So there are lots of different combinations that you can do with these, and it just takes some careful thought to think in terms of the types of revenues that you're going to be able to generate ultimately.
Selecting the right app monetization strategy for your business can seem pretty daunting. Just keep in mind there's no right or wrong answer. There's also nothing wrong with testing a few different strategies and seeing which your prospects resonate with the most, and of course, which makes you the most money. If you are struggling though, here's a bonus for you. Drop a comment below and I'll reach out to book a call with you. We can talk through your business model and I can talk you through how I would approach monetizing your app. Until then, scale smarter.